You're annoyed because your car took 5 extra minutes to warm up this morning. You're frustrated because you had to scrape ice off your windshield before work. You're cold because you walked from the parking lot to your office and the wind cut through your coat for 30 seconds. These are the worst inconveniences that winter inflicts on most of us in the modern world. Minor irritations, temporary discomforts, things we complain about to co-workers while holding our overpriced coffee drinks in climate-controlled buildings. But for the vast majority of human history, for thousands of years across every continent where humans lived, winter wasn't an inconvenience. Winter was a killer. Winter was the season when children died in their sleep from hypothermia, when elderly people went to bed and simply didn't wake up because their bodies couldn't maintain temperature through the night, when entire families starved to death because food supplies ran out in February and spring was still 2 months away, when cities saw their populations drop by 10, 15, 20% between November and March. And everyone just accepted this as normal, as the way things were, as the inevitable price of living in a world where humans hadn't yet conquered the seasons. In ancient Rome, winter killed more people than wars. In ancient Egypt, unexpected cold events triggered social collapse and tomb robberies. Across the ancient world, seasonal mortality was so predictable that families would say goodbye to elderly relatives in autumn, knowing they probably wouldn't survive until spring. Winter was the great equalizer, the season that didn't care about your social status or your political power or your wealth, although wealth certainly helped your odds of survival. But here's what makes this story fascinating. What transforms it from a catalogue of suffering into something more complex and revealing about human adaptation and ingenuity. Some civilizations learned to survive winter, even thrive during it, while others that seemed more advanced, more sophisticated, more powerful, were devastated by cold that nomadic peoples shrugged off as ordinary weather. The Roman Empire, with its engineering marvels and its Mediterranean dominance, saw its urban poor freeze to death by the thousands during harsh winters while living in multi-story apartment buildings in the world's most powerful city. Ancient Egypt, one of history's longest-lasting civilizations, nearly collapsed multiple times when unexpected cold disrupted the Nile flood cycles that their entire society depended on. They had no cultural knowledge of how to handle cold because Egypt was built for eternal summer, and when winter came harder than usual, their civilization fractured. But the Mongols, dismissed by settled civilizations as primitive nomads, mastered winter so thoroughly that they used it as a military weapon. While European armies disbanded for winter and huddled in castles waiting for spring, Mongol armies invaded Russia in December in negative 40-degree weather, moving faster through snowstorms than European cavalry could move in summer sunshine. They crossed frozen rivers with thousands of horses. They besieged cities during blizzards. They turned the season that stopped everyone else into their greatest strategic advantage. Tonight we're going to explore why winter was the hardest season in ancient civilizations by following 3 very different peoples through 3 very different winters. We'll see how Rome's urban poor survived, or more often didn't survive, the brutal winters that struck the Mediterranean harder than most people realize. We'll witness Egypt's crisis when the warm climate they built their entire civilization around turned cold, and their priests couldn't explain why the gods had abandoned the cosmic order. And we'll learn how the Mongols not only survived the most extreme continental winters on Earth, but used those winters to conquer half the known world while their enemies were too cold to fight back. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. Now dim the lights and let yourself remain standing here for a moment longer. As the story begins to move, you'll want to be completely settled in your warm bed, your safe room, your heated house, surrounded by the technological miracles that protect you from the season that once killed millions. Pull up those blankets, adjust those pillows, feel the warmth that ancient peoples would have considered more, because where we're going to 3 different ancient winters, you're going to appreciate that warmth in ways you never have before. The first winter we're visiting is Rome, 312 CE, when the empire that conquered the Mediterranean discovered that you can build the greatest military machine in human history and still freeze to death in your own capital city if you're unlucky enough to be poor. Marcus Flavius wakes to darkness and cold in his 5th-floor room in the Subotai district of Rome, and his first conscious thought, like every winter morning for the past 8 years, is whether today will be the day the brazier kills his family. The room is a single space, maybe 12 feet by 10 feet, that houses Marcus, his wife Julia, their 2 children aged 9 and 6, and Julia's elderly mother, who coughs through the night with a wet, rattling sound that means she probably won't survive this winter. The walls are thin plaster over brick, cracked in multiple places where you can see through to the apartment next door. The single window has wooden shutters but no glass, because glass windows are for wealthy people, and Marcus is very much not wealthy. He's a day laborer when he can find work, which in winter is maybe 2 or 3 days a week if he's lucky. The 5 of them share 2 narrow beds and whatever blankets they've managed to accumulate, and they sleep in all their clothes, because taking clothes off in winter is something only people with heated homes can afford to do. The brazier that Marcus is thinking about, the one that might kill them, sits in the corner of the room glowing with charcoal embers. It's a simple clay pot on iron legs, filled with charcoal that Marcus buys in small quantities when he has money, burning at a rate that he's calculated will keep them from freezing while hopefully not producing enough smoke to suffocate them in their sleep. This is not a theoretical concern. 3 families in this insular building have died from brazier smoke in the 5 years Marcus has lived here. You go to sleep with your portable heater burning, you seal your windows and door cracks to keep the heat in, and sometimes you just don't wake up because carbon monoxide is odorless and invisible, and it kills you while you dream. The temperature outside is probably around freezing, maybe slightly below, which doesn't sound that cold to modern ears, but becomes desperately cold when you live in a building with no insulation, no central heating, walls that are barely thicker than your hand, and wind that comes through every crack and gap in the construction. Roman insulae, the multi-story apartment buildings that house most of Rome's population, were built quickly and cheaply by property investors who cared more about maximizing rental income than about the comfort or safety of tenants. The buildings are 6 or 7 stories tall, made of brick and concrete, where the poorest tenants living on the upper floors, where the climb is hardest and the cold is worst, because heat rises, but that doesn't help much when there's barely any heat to begin with. Marcus pays 8 sesterces per month for this room, which is about 1/3 of what he makes when he can find steady work, and he considers himself lucky to have it, because the alternative is sleeping on the streets, where you'll definitely freeze to death during the hardest winter nights. Julia stirs next to him, pulling the thin blanket tighter around herself and the children who sleep between them for warmth. Her breath makes clouds in the cold air. Everyone's breath makes clouds. The brazier has burned down to barely glowing embers, which means the room temperature has dropped significantly since they went to sleep. Marcus needs to add more charcoal, but charcoal costs money, and he's trying to stretch his current supply to last another week, and every piece of charcoal he adds now is a piece he won't have later. This is the constant calculation of winter poverty in ancient Rome. Every bit of heat costs money you might not have tomorrow. Every day of cold you endure increases your chances of getting sick, and getting sick means you can't work, and not working means no money, and no money means you can't buy charcoal or food, and the spiral continues downward until either spring arrives or you die. It's a very simple equation. Marcus decides to add 3 small pieces of charcoal to the brazier, a compromise between warmth and conservation. He uses a small stick to stir the embers, getting them hot enough to ignite the new charcoal. The pieces catch, and gradually the glow strengthens. In maybe 20 minutes, the room will be slightly less cold. This is luxury. This is the difference between miserable and barely tolerable. This is what passes for comfort when you're poor in Rome during winter. Outside, through the shuttered window, Marcus can hear the city waking up. Footsteps on the stairs as other residents of the insula begin their days. Voices in the street 6 floors below, distorted by distance and wind. The sound of a cart rattling over cobblestones. Rome is a city of perhaps 1 million people, and most of them are cold right now, and some of them are dying right now, and by the time this winter is over, thousands will be dead from causes directly related to the cold. Hypothermia. Fires from overturned braziers, smoke inhalation, pneumonia, respiratory infections, the collapse of weakened buildings under the weight. Winter is the season when Roman actuarial tables, if Romans had actuarial tables, would show a dramatic spike in mortality. The very young and the very old die first, then the chronically ill, then the malnourished, which in winter is most of the urban poor, because food prices rise when grain supplies from Egypt and North Africa are disrupted by winter storms in the Mediterranean. Julia's mother coughs again, a deep, wet cough that brings up fluid she spits into a rag. The old woman is maybe 55, though she looks 70, worn down by decades of poverty and childbirth and labor. She's been declining for weeks. The cold makes it her body can't generate enough heat to fight off the infection in her lungs. This is how most poor Romans die in winter. Not dramatically, not suddenly, just a gradual weakening, a cough that gets worse, a fever that won't break, and then one morning they're dead and the family has to figure out how to dispose of the body because proper funerals cost money they don't have. Julia knows this. Marcus knows this. They don't talk about it, because what would be the point? They keep the old woman as warm as they can with their limited resources. They feed her what food they can spare, and they wait to see if she survives until spring. It's not cruel, it's just realistic. You do what you can with what you have, and sometimes what you have isn't enough, and people die, and life continues for those who don't. Marcus pulls on his second tunic, layering it over the one he slept in. The Roman toga, that iconic garment of classical civilization, is completely useless in winter. It's made of wool, which provides some insulation, but it's a single layer draped around the body with no closures, no way to seal out wind, gaps everywhere that let cold air reach your skin. Togas are for wealthy men attending public functions in warm weather or in heated buildings. Poor men in winter wear tunics, multiple tunics if they own them, belted tight to keep body heat close, with cloaks over top if they can afford cloaks. Marcus owns 2 tunics and 1 threadbare cloak. He wears all of them every day in winter. The children are waking now, stirred by the sounds of their parents moving. The 9-year-old boy, Gaius, looks around the dim room with the wary expression of a child who's learned that mornings mean hunger and cold. The 6-year-old girl, Prima, stays huddled under the blankets, only her eyes visible, breath frosting in the air. Julia sits up, wraps a shawl around her shoulders, and begins the morning routine. There is no breakfast. Breakfast is for people with surplus food. The family will eat once today. In the evening, if Marcus finds work and earns enough to buy bread and maybe some oil or cheap wine. If he doesn't find work, they'll eat the heel of bread that Julia has saved from yesterday, and that will be all. This is standard for winter among Rome's urban poor. You eat less because food costs more and work is scarcer. Your body needs more calories to generate heat, but you consume fewer calories because you can't afford them. It's another equation that solves itself through suffering and survival rates. Marcus leaves the room, descending the dark, narrow stairwell of the insula to the street level. The stairs are treacherous in winter, slick with ice where water has leaked through the roof, uneven from poor construction and decades of wear. People die falling down these stairs regularly. The building itself is a death trap, actually, held together by cheap materials and minimal maintenance, swaying noticeably in high winds. prone to collapse when earthquakes strike or when the weight of snow exceeds the load-bearing capacity of walls that were never properly engineered. But it's housing, and housing in Rome is expensive and scarce. So Marcus and his family and hundreds of other families live here and hope the building doesn't fall down this year. The street level of Rome in winter is a different world from the Rome of summer tourists and historical epics. The grand marble buildings of the Forum and the Palatine Hill might be architecturally magnificent, but they're not where most Romans live. Most Romans live in neighborhoods like the Subotai, packed with tall insulated buildings separated by narrow streets that never see direct sunlight, open sewers running down the middle because Rome's famous sewer system doesn't extend to poor neighborhoods, piles of garbage and human waste frozen in place during cold snaps. The smell is less intense in winter because cold suppresses odors, which is one of winter's few benefits. Marcus walks toward the labor market near the Forum, where men gather each morning, hoping to be selected for day work. Construction work mostly stops in winter because concrete doesn't cure properly in freezing temperatures, and because wealthy patrons don't want to fund projects during the season when materials cost more and workers are less efficient. But sometimes there's dock work, loading and unloading ships, or warehouse work moving grain, or street repair work that can't wait for spring. Marcus joins the crowd of men, maybe 200 of them, standing in the cold, while foremen walk among them selecting workers. The selection is arbitrary, based on who you know, who you've worked for before, sometimes just who looks strongest or most desperate. Marcus is selected today. The foreman, a man Marcus has worked for twice before, points at him and 9 other men and tells them to follow him to the granaries near the Tiber, where grain shipments need to be moved from river barges to storage buildings. The work is brutally hard, carrying 100-pound sacks of grain up steep ramps from boats to warehouses, doing this repeatedly for 8 or 9 hours with brief breaks for water. But no food because you're expected to provide your own food, and Marcus has none. The cold makes it worse. Your muscles don't work as efficiently when they're cold. Your hands lose depth. Your body burns more energy trying to maintain temperature, while simultaneously burning energy to do physical labor, and you're not eating enough to replace what you're burning. So by midday, Marcus is shaking with cold and exhaustion and hunger, but he keeps working because stopping means he won't get paid. The wage for a day's labor is 12 sesterces. Enough to buy bread and some oil and wine for his family, enough to buy a few pieces of charcoal, enough to survive for one more day. The other men working alongside Marcus are in similar condition, undernourished, inadequately clothed, working through exhaustion because the alternative is not working, and that means starvation. Some of them talk while they work, complaining about the cold, about the foreman, about their wages, about the grain shortages that have driven bread prices up 40% this winter. The grain shortages are real. Rome depends on grain imports from Egypt and North Africa, shipped across the Mediterranean in massive grain haulers that can carry enough wheat to feed thousands of people. But winter storms make Mediterranean shipping dangerous, and many merchant captains simply refuse to sail between November and March. The grain that does arrive commands premium prices. The grain dole that provides free bread to Rome's poorest citizens continues, but at reduced rations. The bakers who normally sell affordable bread raise their prices because their costs have risen. And poor families like Marcus's eat less, and children go hungry, and malnutrition weakens immune systems. Diseases spread. By the time Marcus finishes his day's work, collects his 12 sesterces, and walks back toward the Subotai, the sun is setting and the temperature is dropping. The wind has picked up, bitter and cutting, coming from the north where the Alps are heavy with snow. Marcus stops at a bakery and buys a large loaf of bread, still warm for 5 seconds. He buys a small jar of olive oil for 2 sets. He buys enough charcoal for 2 days for 3 sesterces. He has 2 sentences left which he keeps for tomorrow because tomorrow he might not find work. This is success! This is a good day. He has food and fuel for his family. They will eat tonight and be slightly warm and survive another day. Walking through the streets as darkness falls, Marcus passes other insular buildings just like his. Thousands of windows glowing with the faint light of oil lamps and braziers. Thousands of families huddled in small rooms trying to stay warm enough to survive the night. He passes wealthy homes too, the domus-style houses of the Roman elite, and through their walls he can hear the sounds of dinner parties and music, and if he gets close enough he'd feel the warmth radiating from their high-cost heating systems. Hypocausts are one of Rome's great engineering achievements. Underground furnaces that heat air which flows through spaces under the floors and inside the walls, warming entire houses evenly and efficiently. They're expensive to install and expensive to operate, requiring enslaved workers or servants to constantly feed wood into the furnaces, so only the wealthy have them. The temperature difference between wealthy and poor Roman homes in winter is the difference between comfort and survival. Wealthy Romans are genuinely warm. They can remove their heavy cloaks indoors, they can bathe in heated water, their children sleep in warm rooms wearing light sleeping garments. Poor Romans are cold all the time. They never fully warm up between November and March. Their bodies are always burning calories to generate heat, calories they often don't have. Marcus climbs back up the 5 flights of stairs to his room, his legs burning from the effort after a day of labor. Julia has kept the brazier going with their dwindling charcoal supply, and the room is marginally warmer than when he left this morning. The children cluster around him as he enters, knowing he brings food. He hands the bread to Julia, who tears it into portions carefully calculated to give each person enough to stave off hunger while making the loaf last until tomorrow evening. They eat slowly, making it last, tearing small pieces and chewing them thoroughly. Olive oil is precious. Julia drizzles a small amount on each person's bread portion. It adds calories and fat and makes the dry bread more palatable. This is their bread and oil and a small cup of watered wine each. By wealthy standards, by modern standards, it's poverty. By the standards of Rome's urban poor in winter, it's adequate. No one will go to bed hungry tonight. That's success. Julia's mother eats her portion slowly, coughing between bites. She's gotten worse today. Her eyes are fevered. Her skin is hot to the touch despite the cold room. The infection in her lungs is advancing. There is no medical care available for poor Romans. There are doctors, but they charge fees that would consume weeks of Marcus's wages. There are temples where you can leave offerings to Asclepius and hope for divine healing, but divine healing is statistically unreliable. Mostly, you either recover or you don't, and old people with lung infections in cold rooms don't usually recover. Julia sits next to her mother, holding her hand, not speaking because there's nothing to say that would change anything. Marcus adds his carefully hoarded charcoal to the brazier, building it up for the night. This is the gamble every winter evening. Add enough charcoal to keep the family from freezing, but not so much that the smoke becomes dangerous. Leave a small gap in the shutters for ventilation to prevent carbon monoxide buildup, but not such a large gap that all the heat escapes. He's gotten good at this calculation over 8 winters, but it's still a gamble. Some nights you get it right, some nights people die. The family settles in for the night, the children in one bed, Marcus and Julia in the other, Julia's mother in a corner on a pallet of rags. Outside, Rome continues its winter existence. In wealthy homes, slaves bank high-cost fires for the night, ensuring their masters will wake warm. In bathhouses across the city, fires are being extinguished because there's not enough wood to keep them operating daily through winter, so the bathing schedule has been reduced to every 3rd day. Romans who are used to bathing daily now go days without bathing, and the reduced hygiene contributes to disease spread and more people die. In the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Constantine is warm and well-fed and likely not thinking about the thousands of his subjects who are cold and hungry in insular buildings visible from his windows. The empire's power is measured in legions and territories and architectural monuments, not in the winter survival rates of urban poor. In warehouses along the Tiber, grain that could feed thousands sits waiting to be distributed, rationed carefully because no one knows when the next shipment will arrive, because Egyptian grain haulers are waiting for spring weather, because the Mediterranean in winter is too dangerous for crossing. In the insulae of the Subura and the surrounding districts, thousands of braziers burn, producing heat and smoke, and some families will sleep and wake and survive another day, and some families will sleep and simply not wake because the smoke was too much, or because hypothermia claimed them, or because their bodies finally gave up the struggle to maintain temperature with insufficient food and fuel. This is normal. This is winter in ancient Rome. This is what it meant to be poor in the greatest city of the ancient world, the empire that conquered the Mediterranean, that built aqueducts and roads and amphitheaters, that created a legal system and a military machine that dominated Europe for centuries. That empire let its own citizens freeze to death every winter in buildings within sight of heated palaces and marble temples. Not through cruelty, particularly, but through the same indifference that characterizes inequality in every era. The wealthy stay warm, the poor do their best. Some survive, some don't. Spring comes eventually for those who live to see it. Marcus lies awake long after Julia and the children have fallen asleep, listening to his mother-in-law's labored breathing, listening to the wind rattling the shutters, listening to the sounds of the buildings settling and creaking around them. He's calculating again. If he finds work tomorrow, they can continue like this for a while. If he doesn't find work for 2 or 3 days, they'll have to decide whether to spend their remaining money on food or fuel. Food keeps you alive longer, but fuel keeps you warm enough to work, and without work, there's no money for either food or fuel. It's an equation that solves itself through suffering, and Marcus has seen how it solves. He's seen neighbors starve. He's seen families freeze. He's seen strong men reduced to begging in the streets. And he's seen those beggars die when no one gave them anything. He knows that he and his family are perhaps 2 weeks of bad luck away from that same fate. 2 weeks of no work, of the charcoal running out, of the cold getting worse, of Julia's mother dying and the children getting sick. 2 weeks of the small disasters that compound into catastrophe, and they could be gone. This is the reality that wealthy Romans don't see, don't think about, don't have to confront, because their hypocasts burn and their granaries are full, and their winter is an inconvenience rather than an existential threat. He lives it. And tomorrow he'll wake up and descend 5 flights of stairs and walk to the labor market and hope to be selected for work. And he'll do this every day until spring comes or until he can't anymore. This is survival. This is winter in Rome for most Rome. This is the truth behind the marble facades and the imperial glory. And 800 miles to the south, in a civilization that should never have known cold at all, an even stranger winter crisis is unfolding. Nefertari, overseer of the royal granaries at Thebes, stands on the stone steps leading down to the Nile and stares at something she has no word for, because the Egyptian language doesn't have a word for it, because it has never existed in Egypt before in any living person's memory, or in any written record, or in any story passed down from the ancestors. The surface of the Nile, the great river that has sustained Egyptian civilization for 3,000 years, is covered with a thin layer of ice. Not frozen solid, not thick enough to walk on, but ice nonetheless, crystalline and strange, forming along the river's edge and extending several feet toward the center where the current keeps the water moving. It's the 8th year of the reign of Ramesses III, 1176 BCE, according to chronologies that won't be invented for another millennium, and Egypt is experiencing weather that shouldn't be possible. The temperature has dropped below freezing for 3 consecutive nights. Frost has appeared on the ground each morning, white and crystalline and utterly alien to Egyptians who have built their entire civilization in a land where frost doesn't exist, where winter means slightly cooler temperatures but never actual cold, where the eternal summer of the Nile Valley has been the foundational constant of existence for longer than anyone can remember. Nefertari is 42 years old, has served as a grain administrator for 20 years, and has never in her life experienced a cold like this. She doesn't know what to call it. The word for cold in Egyptian refers to the relative coolness of shade, the slight chill of evening. Not this bone-penetrating cold that makes her fingers ache and her breath visible in the morning air. The ice on the Nile is not the only problem, though it's the most visible and the most psychologically disturbing, because the Nile is eternal, is divine, is the source of all life in Egypt, and seeing it partially frozen feels like watching a god die. The larger problem, the problem that Nefertari understands with growing dread, is that this cold is the final confirmation of what the low flood levels over the past 3 years have been indicating. The climate is changing. The summer monsoons in the highlands of Ethiopia that feed the Nile and cause the annual flood are weakening. The flood waters that should rise predictably each year, depositing fresh silt on the fields and allowing the planting of crops, are coming less strongly. Last year, the flood barely covered the lowest fields. This year, and now this unprecedented cold is killing crops that managed to grow despite the low flood. Frost damage to barley and emmer wheat. Vegetable crops turning black and dying overnight. Date palms, those magnificent trees that have fed Egypt for millennia, showing damaged fronds from cold exposure. The agricultural system that has sustained one of history's greatest civilizations is failing. And Nefertari, who is responsible for managing grain reserves and ensuring that the temples and the palace and the workers' villages have food, is watching the reserves deplete faster than they're being replenished. She's been warning her superiors for 2 years. She's been filing reports with the vizier's office documenting the declining grain stocks. She's been recommending emergency measures, rationing protocols, and appeals to other provinces for grain transfers. And she's been largely ignored because Egyptian civilization has never experienced sustained food shortage. And the bureaucracy doesn't know how to process warnings about problems that have never happened before. Nefertari turns from the river and walks back toward the granary complex, a massive structure of mud brick walls and wooden-roofed storage buildings where Egypt's grain wealth is kept. The complex employs hundreds of scribes, measurers, guards, and laborers. It's a sophisticated operation with detailed record-keeping, inventory systems that track every bushel of grain that comes in and goes out, accounting methods that let administrators know exactly how much food is available and how long it will last at current consumption rates. And those calculations, which Nefertari reviews every morning, are becoming increasingly alarming. At current reserves and current consumption rates, factoring in the expected harvest, which looks like it will be significantly below normal again, Thebes will run out of grain in approximately 14 months. That's not speculation, that's mathematics. 14 months until the granaries are empty, and the Nefertari has been presenting these numbers to the provincial governor for 6 months. The governor has been presenting them to the vizier. The vizier has presumably been presenting them to Pharaoh, though Nefertari doubts Pharaoh understands the implications, because Pharaoh is a god-king whose experience of daily life is so divorced from ordinary existence that the concept of running out of food probably seems as absurd as the sun not rising. But the sun is rising. The food is running out. And this cold, this impossible frost, is making everything worse. Inside the granary complex, Nefertari meets with her senior scribes to review the morning's inventory report. The head scribe, a thin old man named Amenhotep, who has worked in the granaries for 40 years, spreads papyrus sheets across the table showing detailed accounts of current stocks. The numbers are precise down to individual measures. This granary contains 47,283 measures of barley. That granary contains 31,157 measures of emmer wheat. Another building holds 15,891 measures of chickpeas. The totals are carefully calculated and compared against the previous week's totals. The comparison shows what Nefertari already knows, but hoped might somehow be wrong. Consumption is exceeding replenishment. The granaries are slowly emptying. They're being drawn down faster than new harvests can refill them, and with each passing month the margin between supply and catastrophe shrinks. Amenhotep looks at her with eyes that have seen too much in his long career, and he says the thing they're both thinking but are afraid to say out loud. If this continues, if the floods don't return to normal, if this cold persists and kills the crops, there will be famine, not localized shortage that can be managed with grain transfers from other provinces. Systemic, widespread famine affecting all of Egypt. Amenhotep remembers stories his grandfather told him, stories from 200 years ago, during the first intermediate period when the central government collapsed and regional governors fought each other for resources and people ate anything they could find. Those stories included cannibalism. They included parents abandoning children because they couldn't feed them. They included the complete breakdown of Ma'at, the cosmic order that keeps Egyptian civilization functioning. Amenhotep doesn't say these things explicitly. He just looks at Nefertari with those knowing eyes, and she understands. They're looking at the possibility of civilization collapse, and there's nothing they can do about it, except watch it happen and try to manage the decline as carefully as possible. Nefertari dismisses the scribes and walks through the granary complex, inspecting the storage buildings. The buildings are well designed for their purpose. Mud brick construction with raised floors to protect grain from moisture, ventilation systems that allow air circulation to prevent mold, wooden roofs that can be removed for loading and unloading. They're designed for Egypt's normal climate, eternal summer with occasional rain in Lower Egypt but almost no rain in Upper Egypt where Thebes is located. They're not designed for cold. No one designing these buildings ever considered cold, because cold didn't exist in Egyptian experience. The mud brick walls, excellent for keeping stored grain cool in summer heat, provide almost no insulation against cold air. The ventilation systems that prevent mold in humid conditions allow freezing air to circulate directly through the stored grain. The wooden roofs that protect against rain don't protect against frost. Nefertari has noticed frost forming inside some of the granary buildings, ice crystals on the walls, moisture condensing and freezing. She doesn't know if this will damage the grain. No Egyptian knows, because no Egyptian has ever had to store grain in freezing conditions. Everything about Egyptian civilization is optimized for heat. The architecture, the clothing, the daily routines, the agricultural calendar, the religious festivals, everything assumes that Egypt is hot and the Nile floods predictably and the sun always shines and the gods maintain Ma'at. But Ma'at is breaking. The cosmic order is failing. The predictable patterns that have sustained civilization for 3,000 years are disrupted, and the priests don't have explanations, and the pharaoh doesn't have solutions. And Nefertari, who is just an administrator, just a person who counts grain and writes reports, is watching the foundations of her world crack. She leaves the granary complex and walks through the streets of Thebes toward her home. Thebes is Egypt's southern capital, a great city of temples and palaces and administrative buildings, home to perhaps 50,000 people. The city is built on both banks of the Nile, connected by ferries, surrounded by agricultural fields that extend back from the river until they meet the desert. The architecture is limestone and mud brick, painted in bright colors, decorated with hieroglyphs and images of gods and pharaohs. It's beautiful in the way that ancient cities built by confident civilizations are beautiful, with monumental scale and artistic ambition and the assumption that this will last forever. But walking through Thebes now, Nefertari sees things that disturb her. She sees people who are too thin, not yet starving but undernourished. The early stages of what happens when food becomes scarce. She sees merchants in the market selling grain at prices that were unthinkable 2 years ago, prices that poor families can't afford. She sees temple priests preaching about the necessity of maintaining religious rituals to restore Ma'at, implying that the problems are caused by human failure to properly honor the gods, rather than by whatever climate forces are actually causing the Nile floods to fail. She sees workers from the Valley of the Kings, the men who cut and decorate the tombs of pharaohs, gathered in small groups talking in low voices about work stoppages and delayed rations. These workers are usually the most privileged of Egypt's labor force, receiving regular grain payments, living in purpose-built villages, doing sacred work that guarantees their place in the afterlife. If they're worried about food, if their rations are being delayed, that means the problem is affecting even protected populations. Nefertari's home is a modest villa in a good district. 2 stories of mud, brick and limestone with a central courtyard, home to herself, her husband, who is a mid-level temple administrator, their 3 children, and several household servants. It's a comfortable life by most standards, the life of the Egyptian middle class, not wealthy like the nobility, but secure and respectable. Or it was secure. Now Nefertari isn't sure of anything. Her husband Kay is home when she arrives, which is unusual because he normally works until evening at the temple. He's sitting in the courtyard with a worried expression, and before Nefertari can ask what's wrong, he tells her the temple is reducing staff. 10% of administrators are being let go, and while Kay wasn't cut in this round, he's been warned that more cuts are coming. The temple's income is declining because the agricultural lands that support the temple are producing less, and the temple can't afford to maintain its full staff. This is devastating news. Egyptian society is built on stable employment in government or temple bureaucracies. You get a position, you do your job competently, you collect your grain rations, and you have security. Losing your position means losing your ration allotment, which means buying food at market prices, which most families can't afford for extended periods. Kai is afraid. Nefertari can see it in his face, the same fear she's been carrying for months but has been trying to hide. They're looking at the possibility of both losing their positions, losing their income, and being unable to feed their children. This fear, multiplied across thousands of families, is what breaks civilizations. That night, Nefertari lies awake in her bed, and for the first time in her life, she's genuinely cold in Egypt. The temperature has dropped again. Her husband and children are huddled together under linen sheets that provide minimal insulation because linen sheets are designed for Egypt's normal climate, where warmth is never a problem. The house, a beautiful mud brick construction with high ceilings and large windows designed to promote airflow and cooling in summer heat, is completely inadequate for cold. The windows have no shutters because Egyptian windows don't need shutters, or didn't until now. Cold air flows freely through the house. The mud brick walls, excellent thermal mass for moderating daytime heat, now radiate cold inward. There is no heating system because who would design a heating system for Egypt? There are no warm clothes because Egyptians wear linen, light and cool and completely useless for insulation. Nefertari has tried wearing multiple layers of linen tunics, but linen doesn't insulate well even when layered. She's cold, her children are cold, and she doesn't know how to fix it because Egyptian culture has no accumulated knowledge about staying warm. Every other civilization that experiences winter has developed clothing and housing and heating appropriate for cold weather. Egypt never needed that knowledge, so it doesn't exist. And now it's needed desperately, and there's no way to develop centuries of cold weather expertise in a single season. The children are crying because they don't understand why they're cold, why their normally comfortable home feels hostile, why their mother can't make it better. Nefertari holds her youngest daughter, trying to warm the child with her own body heat, and she realizes with growing horror that if this continues, if the cold persists and gets worse, children will die. Egyptian children have mortality rates of maybe 30 to 40% under normal conditions, dying from disease and accident and malnutrition and all the normal causes of childhood death in the ancient world. But they don't die from cold because cold doesn't exist in Egypt. Until now. And now cold is added to the list of things that can kill children, and parents have no idea how to protect them. The next morning, Nefertari walks along the Nile again and sees that the ice has thickened. What was a thin skim yesterday is now perhaps a quarter-inch thick in the slow-moving areas near the bank. This is impossible. This is the Nile, divine and eternal, the source of all life, the manifestation of the god Happy, and it's freezing. Some of the priests are saying this is a sign of divine displeasure, that the gods are punishing Egypt for some transgression. Other priests are saying it's a test, that the gods are examining whether Egyptians will maintain their devotion despite hardship. The common people, the farmers and workers and craftsmen who make up most of Egypt's population, are saying the world is ending, that the gods have abandoned them, that Maat has been destroyed and chaos has returned. No one knows the truth, because the truth is that the Bronze Age is experiencing a period of global cooling, probably related to volcanic eruptions in Iceland or Indonesia that threw enough ash into the atmosphere to lower temperatures worldwide, and this is causing the East African monsoons to weaken, which is causing the Nile floods to fail, which is causing crop failures across the eastern Mediterranean, which is contributing to the collapse of multiple Bronze Age civilizations. But Egyptians don't know about volcanic eruptions in Iceland or global climate patterns. They just know that the world has stopped working the way it's supposed to work, and they're afraid. Nefertari spends the day at the granaries doing her usual work, measuring and recording and calculating, watching the numbers that tell her how long Egypt can survive. In the afternoon, she receives a summons to the governor's palace. This is unusual. Normally, she communicates with the governor's office through written reports and occasional meetings with junior officials. Being summoned to the palace suggests something serious. At the palace, she's led to a conference room where the provincial governor, several senior priests, the chief of police, and other high officials are gathered around a table covered with documents. The governor looks exhausted. He's a man in his 50s, appointed by Pharaoh, responsible for maintaining order and prosperity in Upper Egypt, and he's facing problems that no Egyptian governor has faced in living memory. He gets straight to the point. The situation is deteriorating faster than anticipated. The recent cold has killed an estimated 30% of the current crop. Combined with the already low grain reserves and the failed floods of previous years, they're looking at severe food shortage within 6 months. Not the 14 months that Nefertari's earlier calculations projected. The governor wants her recommendations for emergency measures. Nefertari has been preparing for this conversation for months. She presents her analysis clearly. They need to implement rationing immediately, reducing grain distributions to all recipients, including temples and workers' villages and palace staff. They need to halt all non-essential construction projects that consume grain through worker rations. They need to appeal to Lower Egypt for grain transfers, though Lower Egypt is experiencing similar problems. They need to reduce the size of the army because soldiers consume significant grain rations. They need to establish emergency distribution centers and enforce strict controls to prevent hoarding and black market activity. And most controversial, they need to reduce the temple offerings, the enormous quantities of bread and beer and meat that are presented to the gods daily and then distributed to priests. The priests in the room immediately object to this last recommendation. Reducing temple offerings is tantamount to abandoning the gods, they say. It will anger the deities and make the situation worse. It violates every principle of Ma'at and piety. Nefertari listens to their objections and then responds with brutal pragmatism. The gods will have no offerings at all if everyone starves to death. Better to reduce offerings now and preserve enough people to maintain offerings in the future than to maintain current offerings until there's no grain left and civilization collapses completely. The meeting ends without clear decisions because making decisions requires consensus that doesn't exist, requires accepting that unprecedented problems require unprecedented solutions, and requires admitting that the old ways aren't working. Nefertari leaves the palace and walks through streets that are darkening with evening, and she sees things that confirm her worst fears. She sees people gathered around the houses of minor nobles, not begging exactly but waiting, hoping for charity or work or some kind of aid. She sees vendors in the market charging prices for bread that would have caused riots 2 years ago, and people are paying those prices because the alternative is not eating. She sees groups of young men with the dangerous energy of people who have nothing to lose, the kind of restless anger that precedes civil unrest, and, most disturbing, she hears rumors about tomb robberies. Egypt's wealth is buried in its tombs. Pharaohs and nobles and wealthy individuals are buried with gold and jewelry and furniture and provisions for the afterlife. Those tombs are supposed to be sacred, inviolate, protected by curses and by the cultural belief that robbing the dead damns you in the afterlife. But when people are desperate enough, when they're watching their children starve, religious prohibitions starve mattering, there are whispers that workers from the Valley of the Kings, men who know exactly where the wealth is buried because they cut the tombs, are organizing to rob them. This is the clearest possible sign of social breakdown. Egyptian civilization depends on the belief in the afterlife, the belief that this world is just preparation for the eternal world beyond. If people stop believing that, if they start robbing tombs for immediate survival, the entire cultural foundation cracks. Over the following weeks, the situation deteriorates. The cold persists, more crops die from frost, the grain reserves continue to decline. The governor implements some of Nefertari's recommendations, but not all of them. Rationing grain, but not producing temple offerings because the priest's political power prevents it. The workers in the Valley of the Kings go on strike, refusing to work without full rations, and this becomes the first recorded labor strike in history, documented on papyrus that will survive 3,000 years and be studied by historians who will see it as a sign of social stress during the Bronze Age collapse. The strike eventually ends when partial grain payments are restored, but the underlying problem remains. There's not enough food. There will be less food next season, and the season after that might be even worse. Nefertari watches this unfold with the peculiar horror of someone who predicted disaster and was ignored and now has to live through the disaster while knowing it could have been mitigated. She continues her work, continues measuring and recording and calculating, but the numbers keep getting worse. Then, about 2 months after the ice first appeared on the Nile, the tomb robberies began. A minor official's tomb is robbed first, then a more important noble. Then word spreads that attempts have been made on royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The robberies are organized and sophisticated, carried out by people with insider knowledge, almost certainly including some of the workers and guards who are supposed to be protecting the tombs. The police arrest several people, and under torture they confess and implicate others, and a conspiracy is uncovered involving dozens of workers and even some low-level priests. The punishment is death, of course. Tomb robbery is among the worst crimes in Egyptian law, but executing the criminals doesn't solve the underlying problem. People are starving, and starvation makes people desperate, and desperate people will do things that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. Nefertari sits in her office in the granary complex, reviewing the latest inventory numbers, and she's struck by the thought that she's watching a civilization die, not dramatically, not all at once, but through a slow accumulation of failures. The crops fail because the climate has changed. The granaries are empty because crops are failing. People go hungry because the granaries are empty. Hungry people become desperate. Desperate people rob tombs and riot and stop believing in the social order. The social order breaks down because people stop believing in it. And once that breakdown starts, it feeds on itself, accelerating until there's nothing left but chaos and the memory of what once was. Egypt will survive this particular crisis. The Bronze Age cold of the Nile floods will return to something approximating normal. Ramesses III will maintain control and will even achieve some military victories. But Egyptian civilization has been permanently weakened. The absolute confidence that sustained it for 3,000 years has been cracked. The belief that the Nile always provides, that the gods always maintain Maat, that Egypt is eternal and unchanging, that belief has been exposed as false. And once people know that the old certainties aren't certain, once they've seen that the foundations can shake, they never fully believe again. This is what winter did to Egypt. Not sudden destruction, but slow erosion of confidence and capability. And meanwhile, halfway across the world, other people are facing winter that's far more extreme than anything Egypt is experiencing. And they're not just surviving it, they're thriving. They're using it to conquer the largest land empire in human history. Because unlike Rome and unlike Egypt, the Mongols understood winter. They grew up in it, they mastered it, and they turned it into a weapon. 3 civilizations, 3 winters, 3 completely different outcomes. Marcus Flavius and his family huddled in their 5th-floor insular room in Rome, burning charcoal that might kill them to avoid freezing to death, waiting for spring that might come too late for Julia's mother, who coughs blood into rags and grows weaker every day. Nefertari in Thebes, watching the Nile freeze, watching grain reserves dwindle according to mathematical calculations that predict starvation in months, watching her civilization's 3,000-year confidence crack as the gods fail to maintain Maat, and desperate people rob tombs for gold that might buy bread at prices no one can afford. And Subotai leading Mongol cavalry across the frozen Volga in -40-degree weather, comfortable and confident, using winter as a weapon while his enemies huddle indoors and pray for spring. These 3 stories aren't just historical curiosities. They're not random anecdotes about cold weather in ancient times. They're examples of a fundamental pattern that determined which civilizations survived and which ones collapsed, which peoples thrived and which ones barely endured, which cultures grew stronger over time, and which ones were slowly ground down by environmental pressures they never learned to overcome. The pattern is this: environmental adaptation matters more than wealth, more than technology, more than military power, more than any other single factor in determining whether a civilization succeeds or fails over the long term. Rome was the greatest military power in the Mediterranean world, but Roman urban poor froze to death every winter because Roman architecture and Roman economic systems and Roman social structures weren't designed to protect everyone from cold. Rome had the engineering capability to build hypocausts, had the wealth to provide heating for everyone, but chose not to because the economic and social systems that made Rome powerful were the same systems that allowed massive inequality in cold weather survival. Egypt was one of history's longest-lasting civilizations, stable for 3 millennia, but when the climate shifted and brought cold that Egyptian culture had no experience with, that stability shattered. Egypt had enormous accumulated wealth, had sophisticated administration, and had knowledge systems that had been refined over thousands of years. But none of that helped when the fundamental environmental conditions changed, and Egyptian culture had no adaptation template for cold weather. The Mongols had none of the things that civilizations typically value. They had no cities, no monumental architecture, no written literary tradition, no complex government bureaucracy. By the standards of settled civilizations, the Mongols were primitive. But the Mongols had something more valuable than any of those things. They had perfect adaptation to their environment, including its most extreme seasonal variations. They knew winter intimately. They understood cold at a level that settled peoples couldn't comprehend. And this knowledge, this adaptation, this comfort with conditions that killed others, made them militarily unstoppable for 2 centuries and allowed them to conquer the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The lesson is clear if you're willing to see it. What matters most is not what you build or what you know in abstract terms, but whether what you've built and what you know actually works in the environment where you're trying to survive. Rome built an insula that didn't work in cold weather. Egypt built a civilization that assumed eternal summer. The Mongols built portable felt tents and developed food systems and clothing systems that worked perfectly in conditions that would kill Romans or Egyptians. When environment and adaptation are mismatched, people die. When environment and adaptation are aligned, people thrive. It's that simple and that brutal. The historical mortality data, as much as we can reconstruct it from ancient sources and modern archaeological studies, confirms this pattern across cultures and time periods. In temperate and cold climates throughout the ancient world, seasonal mortality followed predictable patterns. Death rates spiked in winter, particularly late winter when food stores were depleted and cold had been continuous for months. The very young died first. Infants and small children whose bodies couldn't regulate temperature effectively. Then the elderly whose metabolism slowed and who couldn't generate enough heat. Then the sick and the malnourished, whose immune systems were already compromised. Then, in the worst winters, healthy adults died too, killed by hypothermia or by diseases that spread in crowded conditions when people huddled together for warmth. In cities like Rome, winter mortality among the urban poor probably approached 10 to 15% in harsh years. That means 1 in 10 people who were alive in November were dead by March. Their bodies disposed of in mass graves or simply left in the streets until warmer weather allowed for proper burial. In rural areas, mortality was typically lower because rural housing was often better insulated and rural families had more direct access to firewood and food. But even rural areas saw mortality spikes in winter. The numbers vary by region and by year, but the pattern is consistent. Winter killed more people than wars, more than plagues in most years, more than any other single cause of death except perhaps childbirth and early childhood disease. Winter was the great limiting factor on ancient population growth. Families had more children than they expected to survive because they knew winter would claim some of them. Communities planned for winter losses. Societies accepted seasonal mortality as natural and inevitable. This acceptance is hard for modern people to understand because we don't experience seasonal mortality. We don't say goodbye to relatives in autumn knowing they probably won't survive until spring. We don't calculate how many members of our community will die over the next 3 months based on historical averages. We don't accept that children and elderly people will simply freeze or starve as a normal cost of living through winter. But ancient peoples did accept this because they had no choice. You can't change what you can't control, and they couldn't control winter, so they adapted their expectations and their social practices to accommodate the reality that winter meant death for the vulnerable. Egypt experienced different patterns because Egypt typically didn't have winter in the same sense. But when cold events did occur, when the climate shifted and brought frost and cold that Egyptian civilization wasn't prepared for, the mortality was catastrophic precisely because it was unexpected. The Bronze Age cold event of the 12th century BCE probably killed more Egyptians than any plague or war of that period, not through direct freezing, though some of that occurred, but through the cascade of failures that cold triggered, crop failures leading to food shortages, leading to malnutrition, leading to disease susceptibility, leading to mass death. The social upheaval that followed, the tomb robberies and the labor strikes and the breakdown of religious and political authority, these were all downstream effects of climate change that Egyptian civilization couldn't adapt to because Egyptian culture had no experience with cold and no knowledge base for surviving it. The Mongols, by contrast, experienced virtually no excess winter mortality because Mongol culture was perfectly adapted to winter conditions. Mongol children were born in winter. Mongol elderly people survived winters that would kill Europeans. Mongol population growth wasn't limited by winter the way European or Russian or Chinese population growth was. This demographic advantage, this ability to maintain population through conditions that killed other peoples, contributed to Mongol military success and to the rapid growth of Mongol population during the Empire period. When your people aren't dying every winter at rates of 10 to 15%, when your children are surviving to adulthood at higher rates than your neighbor's children, you have a larger pool of potential warriors and a larger productive population base. Adaptation translates directly to demographic advantage, and demographic advantage translates to military and economic power. The reason most people don't know these patterns, the reason this isn't common knowledge taught in schools, is that history, as it's usually told, focuses on wars and kings and political events, not on the environmental and demographic factors that actually determined which civilizations succeeded and which ones failed. We learn about Roman military conquests and political intrigue, but not about the thousands of Romans who froze to death every winter in insular buildings. We learn about Egyptian pharaohs and pyramids, but not about the climate events that triggered the Bronze Age collapse. We learn that the Mongols conquered a vast empire, but not that their conquest was enabled by winter capability that their enemies didn't possess. The dramatic stories get told. The slow, grinding reality of seasonal mortality, the environmental factors that killed more people than all the wars combined, these get left out because they're not dramatic. They're just statistics. They're just the background conditions that everyone in ancient times accepted as normal. But understanding these background conditions, understanding the environmental pressures that shaped civilizations, and the adaptations that allowed some peoples to thrive while others barely survived, this understanding is more important than knowing which king fought which battle or which pharaoh built which pyramid. Because the environmental factors haven't gone away. They've just been hidden behind technology, masked by modern heating and modern food systems and modern supply chains that protect us from the realities that ancient peoples faced daily. You're warm right now. You're comfortable in your bed. The temperature in your room is probably somewhere between 65 and 75 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained automatically by a heating system that requires no effort on your part, no careful management of fuel consumption, no calculations about whether you can afford to be warm today or whether you need to save fuel for tomorrow. The food in your refrigerator and your pantry is more than enough to sustain you through winter. You're not rationing. You're not making calculations about whether your food supplies will last until spring. You're not watching your children go hungry because food prices have risen beyond your ability to pay. You have more cold weather survival capability in your heated home than Roman emperors had in their palaces, more than Egyptian pharaohs had in their mud brick houses, and you have this capability without thinking about it, without appreciating it, without understanding how absolutely revolutionary it is in historical terms. Modern heating systems, the furnaces and heat pumps and radiators that keep your home warm, represent the solution to a problem that killed millions of people throughout human history. The problem of how to maintain comfortable temperatures indoors, regardless of outside conditions. Romans tried to solve this with hypocausts, which worked but were expensive and only available to the wealthy. Egyptians never solved it because they never really experienced it as a problem until the climate shifted, and by then their civilization was too rigid to adapt quickly. The Mongols solved it with felt tents and lifestyle practices that worked but required nomadic mobility. Modern civilization solved it with fossil fuel combustion and heat distribution systems that work for everyone, wealthy and poor, urban and rural, at costs that are affordable for most people in developed countries. This is progress. This is genuine human advancement. Not progress in some abstract moral or philosophical sense. but progress in the concrete, measurable sense that people who would have died in 312 CE or 1176 BC or 1237 CE because they couldn't stay warm now survive and thrive because we've solved the heating problem that our ancestors couldn't solve. The global supply chains that deliver fresh food to supermarkets year-round, the refrigeration systems that preserve food without requiring massive quantities of salt or smoke or fermentation, the agricultural systems that produce surplus food in warm regions and ship it to cold regions. These systems mean that winter food shortage, which was the norm throughout history, is now abnormal, is now something that only happens in cases of war or disaster or systemic failure. You're not going to run out of food this winter. Your children aren't going to go hungry. You're not going to have to choose between heating your home and feeding your family. These are problems that billions of humans throughout history faced every winter, and you don't face them, and the reason you don't face them is that modern technology and modern social organization have solved problems that ancient civilizations couldn't solve. This is what progress actually means. Not smartphones or social media or any of the other things that we often point to as evidence of advancement, but the simple, fundamental fact that you're warm right now, that you have enough food, that you're not going to die from cold or starvation this winter, that your children are going to survive, that seasonal mortality is something you read about in history rather than something you experience. That's progress. That's the victory that modern civilization has achieved over the environmental conditions that shaped all of human history until about 200 years ago. But here's the thing that should concern us, the thing that the stories of Rome and Egypt and the Mongols teach us if we're paying attention. It's contingent on conditions staying within certain bounds and on systems continuing to function. Rome's urban poor depended on grain imports from Egypt. When winter storms disrupted those imports, people starved. Egypt's civilization depended on consistent Nile floods. When the climate shifted and the floods failed, civilization fractured. Modern civilization depends on fossil fuels for heating and on global supply chains for food. These systems are working now. They've worked reliably for several generations, but they're dependent on conditions that could change, on political stability and energy availability, and climate patterns that we're already seeing shift in ways that might matter. This isn't a prediction of doom or a claim that modern civilization is about to collapse. It's just an observation that the same principle that governed ancient civilizations still governs us. When environmental conditions change beyond the range that your adaptive systems are designed for, those systems fail and people suffer or die until new adaptations are developed. The Romans couldn't quickly develop new heating systems when winters got harsh. The Egyptians couldn't quickly develop cold weather knowledge when the climate brought unprecedented frost. If our heating systems fail, if our food supply chains are disrupted, if the environmental conditions shift beyond what our modern systems are designed to handle, we'll face the same kinds of cascading failures that ancient civilizations faced, and our sophisticated technology won't help if that technology depends on conditions that no longer exist. The Mongols survived and thrived because their adaptations were robust, were not dependent on complex systems that could break, were embedded in knowledge and skills and cultural practices that couldn't be disrupted by political changes or supply chain failures. A Mongol family could survive winter with just felt and fire and animals and knowledge, could pack up and move to new territory if conditions in one place became untenable, could maintain their lifestyle across enormous geographic ranges and through dramatic environmental variations. This resilience, this ability to survive without depending on systems beyond their control, is something worth thinking about even if we can't and shouldn't try to recreate nomadic life in the modern world. But you don't need to worry about any of this right now. You're safe. You're warm. Your home is heated. Your food supply is secure. Winter outside your window is just weather, not an existential threat. And that safety, that security, that comfort you're feeling right now, that's what millions of humans throughout history would have considered the greatest luxury imaginable, worth more than gold or jewels or political power. The simple experience of being warm and well-fed during the season when your ancestors were cold and hungry and struggling to survive. So before we finish, before you drift off to sleep, take a moment to appreciate your warm bed, your heated room, your full stomach. These aren't trivial comforts. These aren't things to take for granted. These are victories over environmental conditions that killed people for thousands of years. You're warm because of the accumulated knowledge and technology and social organization that modern civilization has developed. You're comfortable because people over many generations worked to solve the problems that made winter deadly. And you're safe because the adaptations we've developed, for now at least, are working. So, before you drift completely into sleep, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling deeper into your blankets, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I'm curious who's out there, who's warm and safe tonight, who's listening to stories about ancient cold from the comfort of modern heat. Now dim whatever lights are still on and let yourself sink deeper into your bed. The stories are finished. The ancient winters are over. Marcus and Julia and their children survived that winter in Rome, though Julia's mother didn't, and Marcus found enough work to keep them fed, and spring came eventually like it always does. Nefertari managed Egypt's grain reserves through the crisis, and the cold event passed after several years, and the Nile floods returned, and Egyptian civilization survived, though it was changed, weakened, less certain of its eternal place. Subotai conquered Kiev and Rus' and rode back to Mongolia with tribute and glory, and he lived another decade before dying peacefully in his ger, having never experienced a winter he couldn't master. These people lived and struggled and survived or didn't, and their stories are done, and now it's time for you to rest. Winter outside doesn't threaten you. The cold can't reach you. The season that killed so many across so many centuries is just background now. Just weather happening outside your window while you sleep in perfect comfort. Let your breathing slow. Let your body relax into the warmth of your blankets. Let the stories fade into history where they belong. You're safe. You're warm. You've survived another day in a world where survival is nearly guaranteed, where winter is an inconvenience rather than a killer, where seasonal mortality is something that happened to other people in other times. Sleep now, rest easy. And remember when you wake up tomorrow morning to appreciate the heat that flows through your walls, the food in your kitchen, the simple miracle of being warm in winter, the victory that your civilization has won over the season that once ruled human life.